Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for this interview.
Happy to see you.
Thank you. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Wes Mitchell visited Greece, Cyprus and the broader region last week. Can you characterize the discussions he had and let us know what the main results of his meetings were?
The most important mission that Assistant Secretary Mitchell had here in Athens was to build on Prime Minister Tsipras's visit to Washington in October. Assistant Secretary Mitchell came here meeting with key players in the Greek government, also in the political opposition, to both reiterate the messages that President Trump had underlined in the Rose Garden back in October, but also to talk about how we move forward, how we build on this extraordinarily positive moment in U.S.-Greece relations to advance a broad range of issues, from trade and investment, as we'll do around the Thessaloniki summit in September, defense and security, which is so important to both of our countries, and it was convenient that this happened just before the big exercise in Andravida, but also energy, where we have a strong convergence of interests and very strong Washington interest in thinking about how we capitalize on our similar perspectives, and then the neighborhood. And I think it was very useful that Assistant Secretary Mitchell's visit to Athens came with these bookends. First, a very intensive program in the Western Balkans, where he was focused on how we, the United States, can work with our European partners to see that all of these countries remain on the European path. They continue to move towards Euro-Atlantic institutions and continue to advance the project of reform. And then also, of course, to Cyprus, where we are interested in seeing the process there get back on track, if at all possible, and also focusing on some of the critical regional energy issues that have been in the headlines recently.
Mm-hmm. The fate of the Greek two soldiers detained in Turkey is still unknown. Can you comment on media reports that Mr. Mitchell told the Greek Minister of Defense that Greece and Turkey should solve their issue on their own?
Yeah, I was surprised by those reports because they really didn't reflect the nature of U.S. engagement. Washington has been strongly engaged on this issue from the first hours. We are supportive of the approach that Prime Minister Tsipras has taken, with the focus on maintaining channels of communication to Ankara, maintaining channels of communication between the Prime Minister and other Greek leaders and their Turkish counterparts, and hopefully achieving the speedy return home of these two officers. Mm-hmm. So nothing could be further from the truth than to suggest that somehow the United States was washing its hands of this issue. To the contrary, these are two NATO allies, and we are keenly interested in seeing this issue resolved.
You mentioned NATO, but there has been a lot of discussion that NATO is always keeping equally distant from Greece and Turkey, and having this position doesn't have the Greek soldiers to come back home.
So I have a different perspective on it. The most important thing to remember here is that Greece and the United States have a very similar interest vis-a-vis Turkey. Mm-hmm. And that was made clear when Prime Minister Tsipras was in Washington. Right. And he was asked by one of your American counterparts something along the lines of, should Turkey be a NATO member? Is it a democracy? Mm-hmm. And Prime Minister there in Washington made very clear Greece's strong interest, which is the same as our interest, in seeing Turkey remain anchored in the West, right, anchored in NATO, focused on Euro-Atlantic European institutions. I think, as we look forward, we have a lot to gain from maintaining very close communications between each other, between Greece and the United States, as we develop our respective agendas vis-a-vis Turkey. And that was very much part of the conversations that Assistant Secretary Mitchell had, for instance, with Foreign Minister Kotzias. I should also note, and I've made this point before, one of the things that has really impressed me in my year and a half here in Greece is the significant soft power influence that Greece has on Turkey. You know, when I travel in the Eastern Aegean, when I was in Chios, Lesbos, Rhodos, you know, all of the harbors are full of yachts with Turkish flags. The restaurants all have their menus in Turkish. Tourism from Turkey is very important to some of those islands, just as investment from Turkey has grown substantially, whether in real estate here in Athens or big projects in Thessaloniki. So those are the aspects of the relationship which I hope over the long term will shape the contours of the relationship between Ankara and Athens. These are issues that the Greek government has to manage. The United States is not the referee. We don't have a yellow card that we can pull out at a moment's notice. But we clearly support the efforts that Prime Minister Tsipras has made with his historic invitation to President Erdogan last December, and everything since then to try to keep reaching out, to keep engaging. Because as hard as that is for you, and as hard as it is for us, there's no good alternative.
Yes, but since Erdogan's visit last December, there has been a serious tension in the Aegean caused by Turkey, and especially in Cyprus and the exclusive economic zone.
So I'll say two things, Alexia. First, I've learned in my diplomatic life not to try to be a fortune teller, because when I predict the future, I usually get it wrong. So I will leave hypotheticals about the future off to the side. What I will say on the question of Cyprus and energy resources, the United States has been very clear in terms of our view about the right of the people of Cyprus to develop the resources of that country's EEZ.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs is flying to Fyrom to discuss his proposal. At the same time, protests against a solution that includes the term Macedonia are taking place mainly in northern Greece, and a bullet was sent to Mr. Kozias' office. Office lawmakers are receiving death threats. How do you see this situation to be developed?
So I'll say two things. One, this was of course an important part of the conversations that Assistant Secretary Mitchell had when he was here in Athens. He was able to share some of his impressions from his discussions in Skopje. The North Star for U.S. policy is Ambassador Nimitz and the efforts that he is leading as the UN negotiator. We want to do everything we can to support his efforts. We are obviously interested in seeing the two sides take advantage of this window of opportunity which has opened, and I think it's very clear to the United States, and it was certainly clear to Assistant Secretary Mitchell when he was speaking with Foreign Minister Kotsias, that the Greek government would like to find a solution. Our experts in Skopje have a similar assessment of the politics there. But the best way that we can support Nimitz, that we can support the diplomacy right now, is by not speaking out or speculating about how the negotiations are going to play out, but rather by underlining America's view that now is the window of opportunity to put this issue behind in a way that's good for Greece, good for people in Skopje, but also good for the wider region. You know, northern Greece especially has this historic link to the countries of the Western Balkans. At different times in history, there have been artificial barriers that were constructed there. One barrier, of course, was the Cold War, during which time there was a geopolitical blockage. But now, with progress on issues around relations between Athens and Skopje, with progress on the issues with Albania, there's a real opportunity for Greece to open up the channels of communication, economic cooperation. It was fascinating for me in Yanina, first of all, to discover how close Tirana is, and to see how much tourism and cultural exchange and commercial exchange goes on. So resolving the name issue is the key that unlocks a broader process of cooperation.
Do you feel the political and economic environment is getting better in order to attract foreign investors, or there are still a lot of things to be done from the Greek side in order to persuade that Greece is a trustworthy place to invest in?
Both. In the sense that, you know, clearly the economic story in Greece is improving. You see that now in 4 quarters of economic growth. You see it in the unemployment figures. But I've been living here in Athens long enough to appreciate the deep economic challenges that Greece faces after 8 years of depression, after 8 years of economic crisis. I am very hopeful that 2018 will be the year when Greece puts that crisis behind it. And I'm particularly encouraged by what I see happening with American investors. There is clear interest now, including on some big projects. You know, we've got, on my radar scope, we've got Hellenikon and interest from Caesars International in a large entertainment complex that could represent an investment on the order of $1 billion. We've got the Syros shipyard. We've got the port of Alexandroupolis. We've got significant new investments from big American players in the tourism sector. You know, companies like Marriott and Avis that are expanding their footprints here because they recognize the economic driver that industry has become. And that's just scratching the surface in terms of the areas where we see renewed interest. You know, energy, tourism, food, agriculture, these are all sectors where there is renewed interest from American investors, where I have American companies coming to me asking about the opportunities in Greece. We're going to do everything we can to support Greece in this effort, and the flagship in that regard is our participation as the honored country at the Thessaloniki International Fair in September. That has 2 objectives. One is, as President Trump put it, to put a positive spotlight on the best of American technology, innovation, entrepreneurship. I will share with you, when I was in Yanina, one of the best parts of that visit for me was going to the university, going to the technology park. We had a entrepreneurship competition run by an NGO called Mindspace. So these were young Greek recent university graduates who put together and were pitching different startup ideas. And you know, every time I have one of these kind of conversations, I think to myself, Greece is going to be all right because you have tremendous human capital and in unlikely places. Who knew? I had no idea Yanina had a startup culture or had a technology park. So we want to do everything we can to support that part of the Greek economic recovery story. But the other goal with TIFF, with the Thessaloniki Fair, is to help educate the American audience about what's happening in Greece, about the government's positive attitude towards foreign investment, about the tremendous human capital resources that this country enjoys, about the opportunities in the sectors where we see revived interest and revived growth. So TIFF is also a fantastic platform for the government to get its story out about the opportunity, the value proposition that Greece represents. So we're going to do all that we can to be helpful, but ultimately the hard work of changing the narrative around Greece, that's something that can only be accomplished by the government.
And my last question, you visited Andravida on Tuesday, you followed the NIOHOS exercise. Regarding the F-16 deal and the reported agreement on the $1.1 billion by the Greek government, what's the US reaction to this?
So let me break that up into two questions. First on Andravida, my congratulations to the Ministry of Defense, to General Christodoulou and the Air Force. It was a fantastic exercise, and I think the breadth of participation there was a really great illustration of the point that we keep making about Greece's role as a regional pillar of stability, as a builder of bridges. The ability to bring in, key partners, Israel, UAE, Egypt, Italy, the UK, the US, Greece, Cyprus. This is something that there are very few players in this neighborhood could accomplish. On the question of the F-16s, this is an issue that was front and center when Prime Minister Tsipras went to Washington in October. Since then, there have been intensive negotiations with the U.S. Air Force, the Ministry of Defense, Lockheed Martin, to try to develop a package that fits within the political framework that the Prime Minister defined. It's very clear everybody wants to get this done. Certainly on the U.S. government side, we're strongly committed to finalizing the deal. So I'm optimistic. But ultimately, the customer is the government of the Hellenic Republic. So it's Greece that's going to have to decide when they are satisfied that this all can be made to fit within the strategic and financial envelopes that you have.